Good afternoon, everybody. We're thrilled to be presenting a rapid response roundtable on exclusion in the Asian American community. Sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, this panel is part one of a series of rapid response webinars on the topic. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. My name is Ruchika Sharma, and I am your moderator for today's roundtable, as well as the Program Associate for the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the ABA section of International Law. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you do not see these controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of today's roundtable. We will also be sharing a recording of today's program to everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we're thrilled to bring you today's program, Roundtable on Exclusion in the Asian American Community, Part 1. In Who Counts as Asian, Jennifer Lee and Karthick Ramakrishnan share findings of an empirical study on understandings of the Asian American category. They reveal significant patterns of South Asian exclusion, especially as Asian American is commonly used as a proxy for East Asian. This roundtable gathers law professors, administrators, and practitioners to discuss how exclusion in the Asian American community has implications for legal education, the legal profession, courts, practice, and the international context. So I'll now turn it over to one of the co-authors of the paper, Who Counts as Asian, Karthick Ramakrishnan.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm just gonna have essentially just one slide that I want to present in this research. What Jennifer Lee and I did, and I'll say, we did this under the aegis of both AAPI Data, which is a resource, which is a project that I founded and have been directing since 2013, as well as the National Asian American Survey. What we had, I think, observed and studied as part of our work on Asian American studies, as well as survey research more generally, was that it was important to ask not only how different Asian American groups viewed themselves, but how others would view them. And we had seen a fair amount of evidence, I think, both in our own professional lives as well as through scholarship, especially qualitative research, which suggests that that the dominant view of Asian America is still one that is East Asian, and that South Asians are either not seen as Asian American or maybe somehow less when compared to East Asian Americans. More generally, we've seen a fair amount of mobilization among South Asians and also among Filipinos under the hashtag Brown Asians. This pretty strong pushback of somehow thinking of Asian as yellow. As offensive as that may sound, there have been a fair number of Asian Americans that have been trying to reclaim that label of Asian Americans as yellow, and a big question in terms of where Brown Asians fit in. So one way we approach this question in a survey context is to ask respondents, and these include Asian Americans as well as non-Asians. So we had nationally representative samples of whites, African Americans, as well as Latinx populations. And we asked the extent to which different groups, they would characterize different groups as very likely to be Asian, somewhat likely to be Asian, or not likely to be Asian. And then we were able to compare how these different target groups would be classified by Americans, including Asian Americans. And let me see if I can share my screen to show you all what we found. Just one second. And by the way, this article from Ethnic and Racial Studies is ungated for the rest of the year. So you can, if you go to Ethnic and Racial Studies and you look for this article, it is free to download through the end of December. There's been a lot of interest in this study. And most simply, when you look at this, we find that Filipinos are excluded to some extent. But the group that is predominantly excluded, the groups that are predominantly excluded from the Asian category are Indian Americans and Pakistani Americans. We didn't ask about every single group, so we asked about Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipinos, Indian Americans, Pakistanis, and Arabs. And in fact, when you look at Pakistanis, Americans are about as likely to classify an Arab as Asian as they are to classify a Pakistani as Asian, which is to say very low. Indian Americans slightly more likely. It is statistically significant, the difference between Indians and Arabs in terms of Americans more likely to classify Indians as Asian Americans than to classify Arabs as Asian American. But it's a big difference that we see between East Asians and South Asians in terms of who people think about when they think about Asian American. And this is in some ways at odds with reality. So you see South Asians that have grown significantly in their numbers. East Asians they have not been the majority of the Asian American population for decades now. And in fact, they're less than 40% of the Asian American population today. South Asians have been the fastest growing segment in the Asian American population, and it's over a quarter of the Asian American population. In fact, one thing I should note, and this is in some ways hot off the presses, if you look at the largest Asian alone group in the United States today, if you look at the 2019 one-year file, Indians are more numerous than Chinese. That is actually historic. We have never had that in the history of Asian America. And yet, there are all sorts of question marks about whether Indians and other South Asians belong in the Asian category. And I think it's important to have this conversation today. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karthik. We really appreciate it. We'll now turn to Mira Dio, Professor of Law at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, Director of the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, and William H. Newcomb Fellows Research Chair in Diversity and Law at the American Bar Foundation.
Thank you so much. I am really thrilled to be here today, especially thanks to Nadia, who read and ran with my tweet, wondering aloud if anyone would be interested in having a roundtable discussion surrounding Karthik and Jennifer Lee's article, Who Counts as Asian? And so many of the people that you see here today are friends and colleagues that I tagged in that tweet. And I really appreciate this organic process. Thank you especially to the ABA, the American Bar Foundation, and Leslie for co-hosting, sponsoring this event. So I'm going to share a couple slides as well, but I'm going to start off my 3 to 5 minutes with a story, because I think this is so illustrative of the article. I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley in the mid-90s, and I was minimally involved, I'll say, in clubs, especially clubs involving other Indians or Indian Americans, which is probably how I would have identified myself in some ways. And there are a bunch of different organizations that you could have joined, including at some point a new Indian American fraternity that I stayed away from. But I was mainly involved when I was involved in performance things, cultural things, singing or performing classical Indian dance. And I did identify strongly as Marathi, the region of India that my family's from, and also as Indian and also as American. In 1997, I started law school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I was in for a real culture shock for a number of reasons. But one thing that still stands out to me more than 20 years later. One day, my first semester in school, I saw a young woman, I probably identified her as Indian or Indian American at the time, on the undergraduate campus, just walking through campus, and she had a jacket on. And the jacket had 3 Greek letters embroidered in the corner. And I knew from my time at Berkeley that those Greek letters were affiliated with an Asian American sorority. And so when I saw her, I thought, I guess in Michigan, we count as Asian American. And that was sort of my indoctrination or assimilation into this broader social global community. So in my time today, I want to share some findings from the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, which you might know as LESI. In 2017, LESI published the first ever report drawing from a national sample of law students focused on law school diversity within the Asian American community. And the report highlights an important point, which I think is useful for us as a starting point for our discussion today. The Asian American community is not monolithic. We're comprised of people from a multitude of backgrounds, nations, languages, religions, and immigration or refugee or asylee experiences. So who are Asian American students? Well, LESI data show that Asian American law students include those who come from a variety of backgrounds, including Chinese, Korean, Indian, Filipino, Japanese, and Vietnamese, as well as smaller percentages of other groups. So my remarks today are focused around one central theme from the article. The authors note, quote, that when only East Asians count as Asian and subgroups are excluded, narratives of Asian Americans' experiences, outcomes, and attitudes are not only incomplete, but also biased. So I'm going to walk you through just a few differences within the Asian American community so they're no longer hidden, but instead they can be emphasized and celebrated. The LESI survey uses parental education as a proxy for socioeconomic status. The vast majority of Asian Americans have parents who completed college, but 59% of Vietnamese American students are first gen. Their parents did not complete college, as compared to roughly a quarter of those from other groups. In addition, 65% of Vietnamese and Japanese respondents have merit scholarships. So these are scholarships that they get based on their test scores and grades, things like that. And the LSAT score differences suggest that Chinese respondents actually would have received these scholarships in the highest proportions, but their rate is 57%, tied with Filipinos. So some interesting parallels between Vietnamese and Japanese, as well as Chinese and Filipino. The need-based scholarships award trending is much more predictable, with a quarter of Filipino and Vietnamese students getting A's. LESI also asks respondents how they spend their time. And while employment can be a useful part of the law school experience, if you're an RA or TA, especially, for others, the work is motivated by necessity, not necessarily law practice. So among the 6 different subgroups, Vietnamese respondents are most likely to report being employed, especially in non-law jobs. Chinese as well as Japanese students are most likely to report spending time providing care to dependents as well, compared to only 12% of Koreans. So again, if we had aggregated the data, put everything together, we would miss these important nuanced differences among different ethnic groups. And so I really applaud you, Karthik, for this article and for giving us an opportunity to talk about differences within the Asian American community. We can continue to draw from the political and community support and still recognize and celebrate those differences. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mira. Next, we'll hear from Shichun Chen, research social scientist with the American Bar Foundation. From your perspectives as an empirical scholar, how does the findings of the paper influence future empirical research on Asian American lawyers?
Thank you, everyone. Great to be here today to discuss this wonderful paper. So today, Asian Americans make up a significant number in law schools and the legal profession. Within a span of a generation, Asian Americans have become a visible presence in all sectors of the legal profession. For my presentation today, I would like to briefly talk about the key findings of our ABF project and the implications of the paper, Who Counts as Asian? Building on the findings of the American Bar Foundation after the JD study, the first project examines the role of Asian Americans in the legal profession. The original project documented the historically dramatic growth of Asian American lawyers over the past 3 decades. It also examines the recent and sharp decline in law school enrollment and the limited number of Asian Americans in the profession's highest leadership positions, from judicial clerkships to law firm partners, to top prosecutors and judges, to law school deans and nonprofit executives. In short, the project 1.0 has begun to document and situate Asian Americans in the legal profession. But we know further research needed to be done. So the main goal of our new ABF project 2.0 is to begin the process of creating a more detailed, descriptive data set about Asian Americans in the legal profession. Before we can provide answers to the challenges of developing a more diverse legal profession, we must first identify and analyze the factors that have, well, facilitated and frustrated the goals of diversifying the profession. So, although there is a growing interest in diversity in the legal profession, we still lack a fundamental baseline understanding of a more detailed demographics of the profession, particularly with regard to Asian Americans. Therefore, the first phase of our project is to seek to provide a comprehensive empirical account. However, a recurring question that we faced over the past year is, what is your definition of Asian? A question that is so difficult to answer given the many definitions used by existing studies. So the paper, Who Counts as Asian, offers a new theoretical framework for future empirical studies on Asian Americans in the legal profession, and more broadly, for further policy debates that deals with diversity and inclusion in different legal settings. So to be very specific, place this in context, I think a good place to start is what I called the three mysteries about Asian American lawyers. The first mystery is about law school enrollment. Asian American enrollment, in particular, has declined more steeply than any other groups since the Great Recession. After rising for 4 decades, the number of Asian American lawyers is projected to stagnate beginning in 2030. So the second mystery is about when students first consider going to law schools. The survey found that 28% of Asians first consider law school after college, compared to only 16% of law students overall. Meanwhile, while more than half of all law students first consider law schools before high school, but only 45% of Asians did. And the third last mystery is the high attrition rate. For nearly 20 years, Asian Americans have been the largest minority group at major law firms. But compared with their numbers within the overall law firm population, Asian Americans are less well represented than other groups at the management level. And perhaps most surprisingly for us is, according to the After the JD study, the attrition rate for Asian Americans, as for other minority groups, is disproportionately high. According to one of our ABF scholars, quote, "It was as if there were a mysterious forces pushing Asian Americans out of the legal profession," unquote. So, unfortunately, we don't have a clear answer as to the causes of those three questions. The paper Who Counts as Asian suggests that we scholars should rethink those questions based on possible and hopefully better theoretical framework. In essence, I think we should re-examine how data was collected, how we make use and interpret existing data. And finally, we should reimagine possible ways of improving existing diversity initiatives in different legal settings based on those new findings. So in summary, I think the paper provides a valuable approaches for both practitioners who cares about diversity and scholars conducting empirical research. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. We'll next hear from Shruti Rana, Assistant Dean for Curricular and Undergraduate Affairs, Diversity Officer, Director of the International Law and Institutions Program, Professor of International Law Practice, and Wells Scholar Class of 1963 Professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. From your perspectives as Assistant Dean and as Professor, are some of the trends you see emerging related to the exclusion or inclusion of South Asians in the process of identity formation at the undergraduate and law school levels?
Well, first, I'd like to also thank you for inviting me to speak here, and thank you to Nadia for putting this together. So, as you noted, I'd like to speak about some of the issues that we see emerging among current college and law students in terms of connecting South Asians to the larger AAPI umbrella, and connect these experiences to some of the larger themes emerging from the research we're discussing today, as well as questions that I think merit further research moving forward. So first, as you're all aware, the university experience is a critical time of fluid identity formation and formal and informal racial identification. Most critically, I think what I'd like to focus on today, it's also a place where students have the opportunity to engage in various forms of social and political engagement with the groups around them. These forms of engagement, I think, reflect some of the most interesting implications from the research that we're discussing today. I'm at a large Midwestern Big Ten university, and we're seeing some really interesting trends that I think point to two things: pressure on this larger AAPI umbrella identity, but also some points of solidarity on what it means to be included in the definition of Asian American. So first, for some background, I think it's important to note, because I do this over and over when I speak in different contexts, that for students who are currently in college and law school, it's important to recognize that their political experience is bounded on one side by the Muslim ban, and on the other side by the COVID rise in xenophobia and hate crimes against groups that appear Chinese or potentially Chinese. Their memories of the first Black president and what came before are already hazy. So what we're seeing is that students and advocacy groups are using these critical moments of exclusion and targeting to build coalitions and enhance solidarity across AAPI groups, as well as engage with the larger Black Lives Matter movement today. Second, coalition building across East Asian and South Asian students, we're seeing differs by gender. So in our work, we've seen that South Asian women are more likely to participate than male students in social justice advocacy work in general, as well as specifically under the AAPI umbrella. This probably reflects the compounded intersectional discrimination these students face, not only at school, but also at home and prior to entering the university environment. Third, we're seeing an increasing number of students finding some solidarity in a sort of cross-emerging identity that has been called a MIMSA. And again, we're seeing more women than men sort of acknowledging this identity. This is a political identity construction that groups Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian identities and the common experiences around racial profiling and surveillance, which again has intensified over the last 4 years. Fourth, we're seeing that one of the groups most likely to engage in cross-group AAPI advocacy and identity formation is actually international students. I think this is really interesting because that cuts against the prior research that implies that the length of time we've spent in the United States influences identity formation. And, in our experience, these students, international students, are often the most financially and socially precarious students. And they're also facing a common form of exclusion and the constant threat of deportation, no matter which Asian country they are from. So this suggests that the intensity of their exclusion is playing a role here. Fifth, we should be wary of some other trends that are moving against solidarity. Over the past 8 to 10 years or so, we've seen students start to split off from social. They're starting to split off social from political advocacy. So, sort of enhancing more or engaging more deeply in groups that are more social than anything else. We've also seen different levels of radicalization. We attribute this in part to the rise of polarizing social media such as WeChat and WhatsApp. That's definitely playing a role at the university level as well. So finally, I want to leave with a note about, again, sort of connecting the university experience to the research that we're seeing for students, while they're in college and law school, but also when they enter the profession. One of the biggest problems we see over and over at the university level is the lack of institutional memory. So students will come in, engage in advocacy work, build something up, and then they leave and a new group has to start over. Right? This is reflected in the AAPI or Asian American Solidarity movement in general. I see over and over that my students are facing some of the same questions and issues that I did when I was in college and law school in the 1990s. And it's heartbreaking to see sometimes because they're always refighting the same battles that I thought had already been won, right? And we just see these cycles over and over again. So there's a lot of research suggesting that one of the key reasons for this is that the AAPI or Asian American movement in the United States has not reached a critical mass mass sufficient to break through to the wider American consciousness. I think this article that we're talking about today really reveals that, right? There's a disconnect between how Asian Americans see themselves and how groups outside of that see themselves. So what that means, until you get to that critical mass and break through to this consciousness, each generation ends up just repeating what came before. They're looking at what came before, like in a history book or something that has to be uncovered, as opposed to something that's part of their experience that they carry with them. So I think this research that we're considering today is really important to thinking about how greater solidarity is critical to the greater political power that could change all of this, and in turn go back and influence inclusion in the professions and the various professions that we're looking at. So thank you. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Vinay Harpalani, Associate Professor of Law and Henry Wayhoffen Professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law. So what do you see are the different ways that South Asian Americans have been racially classified and characterized, both by the government and in everyday life?
Thank you. I'm going to give kind of a historical perspective and also one from my own experience. I write about what I call racial ambiguity, kind of the idea that people are characterized racially different in different contexts. I've written an article called They Secret, Theorizing the Racial Ambiguity of South Asian Americans, and written a few pieces related to this. I'll try to explain this from a more historical context, just seeing how South Asians in the US have been categorized both formally in legal terms in terms of race and more informally. Now, going back to the early 1900s, there was a small number of immigrants from the South Asian subcontinent that came over to the US. And in order to become US citizens, they had to prove that they were legally white because naturalization was limited to white persons. And there was a US Supreme Court case, US v. Thind, where the Supreme Court ruled that Asian Indians are not white. They are Caucasian, but they don't fit the common person's conception of white and therefore are not white and not eligible for citizenship, not eligible for naturalization. And this was 1923, the Thind case. Not much Asian Indian immigration going on. There were, it was kind of cut off until after World War II. After World War II, you started having more immigrants from the Indian subcontinent. I'll talk a little bit about the Immigration Act. But as you saw a different racial classification. In the 1970 census, going from 1923 to 1970, Asian Indians were classified as white, in spite of the Thind case back in 1923, when they were explicitly not white. In 1970, in census, they were classified as white. And in this case, being classified as white denied Asian Indian immigrants some of the protections that minority groups had earned in the 1960s. So there's kind of a political motivation behind this. Now, Asian Indian groups lobbied to be reclassified, and for the 1980 census, Asian Indian became part of the Asian Pacific Islander category, and that's where they've remained since. But even in terms of whiteness, you see kind of different ways that Asian Indians, South Asians have been classified. What are some of the other different racial characterizations of South Asian Americans? Well, we have the kind of model minority idea where we're associated with other Asian American groups, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, and this has to do with the Immigration Act of 1965, which really allowed educated professionals from all of these Asian countries to come into the US, and their children tended to do well academically and kind of laid the foundation for the model minority idea. But you also have South Asians characterized as kind of an Arab Muslim. You have this kind of a terrorist stereotype that's particularly after 9/11 taken off. And Karthick's data really spoke to me because he said that Pakistani Arabs are not viewed as Asian American quite as much, and it may be because of the different racial tropes. You have this terrorist trope, but then you also have Trump's characterization of the China plague, which obviously is a kind of different type of idea, which people may associate more with negative stereotypes of Asian Americans. At times, South Asian Americans have also been characterized as Black, and that's because you have a large variation in skin color within the group also. Incident back in 2015 in Alabama, recent Asian Indian immigrant Suresh Bhai Patel was beaten by the police after he was reported by someone in his neighborhood saying that there was a quote unquote skinny Black guy walking around. So, all of these different characterizations. And I'll just end up by kind of tying this to some other kind of sociological, socioeconomic issues, because you think about the different stereotypes of South Asian Americans. You have the occupational stereotypes as doctors, computer professionals, but then you have very different stereotypes as cab drivers, and you see South Asians occupying all these different niches, motel owners, 7-Eleven owners. So you have a whole variety of kind of socioeconomic statuses, which are linked to race and linked to educational level. So, broadly, I think all of this contributes to us being characterized racially in different ways. And of course, that affects whether we're viewed as Asian Americans or not. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Sarah Chowdhury, Professor of Law at the Florida International University College of Law. So in your perspective, what are the problems and possibilities of South Asian as a category of identity? What are groups that are invisibilized through the use of subcategories, and what would inclusion require?
So again, I echo everybody's thanks for inviting me to this panel. As Mira says, it's nice to be amongst friends and have this conversation, which I think is very timely and perhaps overdue. So I want to start off with telling you two very small short stories from my own experience. And before I tell you these stories, I should say that I am actually a dual citizen. I'm from Bangladesh and a naturalized U.S. citizen. So my perspective is slightly perhaps different than some of the panelists, and I'm also somebody who studies comparative law, and particularly the law of South Asia. And on top of that, I've lived in about 8 countries. I was born in Africa, so I have a very weird perspective, maybe a unique perspective on race issues. So this is the story. Then the reason I'm going to tell you this story is because it tracks sort of some of my concerns about the category of South Asian and Asian sort of identity in general. The first is from my experience at the National Academies of Science about 15 years ago. I was in a meeting with the head of the National Academy of Engineering with my boss, who is a demographer, PhD in sociology. And we were there to talk about about diversity in engineering. And, he was sitting there, engineering dude is, behind the desk, my boss next to me, and I knew this was coming. So my boss says, so we're here, and we're really interested in looking at how Asian and Indians are represented in engineering. And I look over at him and I say, oh, Asian and Native Americans? And he looks at me and he says, no, Asian and, Indians from India. And I look at him like with my, face, and I look at him and I say, Indians are Asians. They're from Asia. It's a geography, right? And at which point he was like, okay, why did I say that? Because I spent part of my growing up years in Europe, in England. And there, when you say Asian, we're really talking about South Asians. We're talking about Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshis. And Bangladeshis are quite dominant there, right? Second story, dial earlier to this year. I get dragged on Twitter to hell and back by strangers, as usual on Twitter, because I propose a new way of talking about people of color. Instead of calling them BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, I propose that we expand that to Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, Asian, and other minorities. Oh, people were not happy about the inclusion of Latinx people or Asians in what they consider to be a term that visibilizes or highlights Black and Indigenous experiences, and then lumps everybody else into people of color, right? As though Latinx, communities, their experiences is not as bad as that of the other two. So there was a lot of conversation that was called anti-Black. The Asian community, the Eastern Asian community, really felt seen, visibilized, and they tweeted, yes, we, finally someone is noticing that somebody, we too are subject to racism. And one woman from Bangladesh said to me, I don't need to be included. And I said, well, you know, we also face a lot of discrimination, and there's a lot of discrimination amongst, you know, against us. And she said, well, I don't think I'm fit into South Asia. I don't consider myself South Asian. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm a Bengali. Now, that's not just Bengali exceptionalism, which there's plenty of, but in this case, it's not what's happening. So this is what's going on, right? She doesn't consider herself part of South Asia because very oftentimes Bangladeshis and Bengalis, Bangladeshis particularly, are not really included. So in the Asian American category, South Asia is left out, story number one, right? And in the South Asian stories, not everybody is covered. In the article that we are talking about, there are 32 references to Indians and Pakistanis and 1 reference to Bangladeshis. And I understand that there's an explanation for that, but that sort of double erasure is happening across the board. And in this case, right, so you cannot use a proxy of Indian and Pakistani for South Asia. This is a problematic you know, usage, because Bangladeshis don't fit the mold. We don't have the high income of Indian and Pakistani Americans. In fact, our average, you know, household income is less than the median of all Americans. We tend to be more impoverished than any other, except for Bhutanese, any other Asian population. We are not, you know, the model minority in many respects. We are in low-paying jobs and very, very localized in primarily two places, New York and Washington, D.C. You don't see us, you know, as widely sort of recognized as you do Indians in terms of CEOs, and, you know, we've got prominent South Asians. And even when we have prominent Bangladeshis, they're not necessarily recognized as Bangladeshis. So we don't fit that mold. And the use of South Asian is a historical artifact that is very, very new. It is not something that was prevalent until, I would say, the 1980s, probably. We can engram this and find out. But prior to, you know, decolonization, just during that period, what was considered contiguous South, you know, the Indian subcontinent was Burma, Bhutan, Nepal, you know, probably up to Afghanistan. So we're talking about a huge geographical span and a lot of variation within this geography in and of itself. So the question then becomes, what does South Asia do for us? And how does this actually, who does it help? Who does it visibilize? Who does it you know, actually sort of help, right? And perhaps it helps all of us if we're recognized as South Asian, but some of us are not. As Vinay pointed out, you know, there is this history of trying to become white on the part of South Asians in order to gain acceptance. And in fact, for Bangladeshis and Bengalis, it's been passing as Black that has allowed them to enter into, you know, the United States, right? And there's actually, last year there was a play that was being done. I'll see if I can add this to the chat screen so you can see it. It's kind of an interesting thing, by a Bangladeshi and Black American that basically explores this passing into Blackness. Vivek Bald has written about Bengali Harlem, right? So we have, within our own communities, we have issues of a great deal of variation in terms of our own racial politics, as well as our notions of belonging, etc. And so if we are critiquing the lack of visibility or the lack of inclusion within of South Asians, then consider this a critique of the lack of inclusion of Sri Lankans, not mention what, Nepalese, all of the marginal to Indian and Pakistani identities of South Asians. So this is, you know, it's a thing that we also need to contend with as we move forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Manjusha P. Kulkarni, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA. So as a former executive of South Asian Network and executive director of APCON, a coalition of 40+ community-based organizations serving LA's 1.5 million AAPIs, what does it mean to see oneself as South Asian American, and for other AAPIs to see South Asian Americans as AAPI?
Thanks, Ruchika, for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to join this illustrious panel. As Mira pointed out, really, I think the first time I've been invited to a panel via Twitter, so I guess that speaks to its utility. But for me, these are really issues of aspiration and inspiration. My analysis comes largely from the field through my work at SAN and at APCON, but also by just looking at my UCLA students over the past several years. And when we think about that construct of South Asian American, right, a number of our speakers today have talked about ways in which it's political, right? Gaining political power, serving as potentially a voting bloc, using it for policy advocacy. And then we also know it as cultural, art, dance, music, food, and even one's upbringing, family, community, ways in which, again, we identify as South Asian American. Unfortunately, though, for many of us, and again, looking out at the field, most of our clients at SAN and community members did not see themselves as either part of the collective of South Asian American or as Asian American Pacific Islander. And instead, their identity stemmed really from that concept of the nation state. As being Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, and Nepalese. And so what I want to ask today is, what are those benefits? What are the ways in which our interests are aligned as South Asian Americans, and also as part of the more universal Asian American Pacific Islander? We know that for the latter, that really came out of an Asian American movement, right? In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where Asian Americans were really beginning to see and gain political power, see opportunities. And at this moment in 2020, I think it presents us with so many opportunities to think about and look at the lessons learned, not only from our East Asian sisters and brothers, but also from African American and Latinx community members, right? There's similar levels of diversity. They don't often get talked about within Latinx communities and even African American communities. Other than perhaps the issue of language, there are also many cultural differences among those who identify in those particular blocks. And so I think we have an opportunity in terms of mandating, essentially demanding that inclusion. And I say that as a leader of a Pan-Asian organization, with the change in numbers that Karthik talked about, and with our now efforts to demand that power and seek ascendancy, there really are, I think, some tremendous benefits that can be gained, and we have to look at those as we approach the next decade. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Aya Gruber, a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School. So a couple questions for you. What are the advantages of heterogeneous identities coming under the umbrella one identity term, Asian? What obligations do more privileged members of the group have to more marginalized members and more marginalized people of color as a whole? And
thank you so much. You cut off at the end, but I think I know what your last question was. And I think it was about biraciality, because that's the one I suggested. So first, I really want to thank Mira and Nadia and the American Bar Association, American Bar Foundation. When Mira first tweeted about this amazing article and the question of who counts as Asian, which I think it might be interesting just to have as a hashtag on its own, I thought, I wanna know, who counts as Asian, and I was thrilled to be tagged on that. And especially because I still consider myself a newbie to Twitter. It's been about a year now, and if ever there wasn't a year to join Twitter, this was the year not to join Twitter. So amongst all the doom scrolling, I was like, this is great. Who counts as Asian? And I was thrilled to be tagged on this panel of who counts as Asian. And then I started thinking to myself, well, wait a second, I'm a half Japanese person. I'm an imposter on this panel. I don't think I count as Asian. And then I thought to myself, well, wait a second, that is the point, right? That is the point, sort of discussing what it means to coalesce in this contested world of identity. And so, I thought, what is the point for a person with my very specific background? And there were a few people like me, but Japanese Americans of my generation, my parents' generation, and even one generation, like ahead, are their experience and outlook, I think, on being Asians is very much colored by the internment and the seizure of land. And also in my generation of Japanese Americans, there are a lot of biracial people, because that internment experience was really a diaspora within a diaspora, right? So Japanese have some of the highest rates of outmarriage, racial outmarriage. So that's a very specific experience that have aligned a lot of Japanese Americans of a certain generation more with African-American civil rights movements and the very vocal sort of Black Lives Matter calls against racialized government detention. But that could be a very different experience than, for example, more recent immigrants who are more allied with, fighting against the very genocidal anti-immigrant sentiments of the Trump administration. So I was thinking, you look at the category Asian, or even, Asian American, I think is what we're talking about. And by American, I don't mean citizens, I mean people in America, in the United States, I should say, Asian United Statesians. It encompasses a range of experiences, a range of, skin colors, a range of socioeconomic levels, a range of cultures, and these can be contested and conflicting in and of themselves, as Saira mentioned. So then, what's the point? What's the point of a broad coalition that calls itself Asian and being included among it? And I think Shruti gave us the answer. The point is solidarity, right? And then we can ask, well, what's the point of solidarity if you have one part of the group fighting against affirmative action and another part of the group barely struggling to survive in, in very impoverished, marginalized situation? What's the point of a coalition? What's the point of solidarity? And I think Shruti also gave us the answer to this. The point of solidarity is justice. And so when I think of being included in Asian American and what it means to be Asian American, I think a lot about some of the writings, for those unfamiliar, of the Lat Crit movement, which a few of us here have belonged to. And it really is about the question of who is facing injustice in what context at what particular time. And those things shift, right? So as a South Asian American with dark skin in the South, in a heavily policed area, a person can be extremely at risk of violent, deadly discrimination. And that same person might be a doctor. So in terms of economics and class, that person can have relative privilege. So one of the things that the LACRIT formation was about building broad coalitions amongst people of color and centering different sites of marginalization at different critical times. So for example, with the Wuhan virus, fear mongering and hate mongering, you might center an East Asian appearance, right, at that time in the efforts, to bring justice. But at other times, right, and with policing, for example, you might center another Asian group or even another group of people of color. So those are a couple of thoughts, I was thinking about, that people are marginalized in different contexts at different times. And I think one of the points of coalition building is to use the relative privilege of other group members at that particular time on behalf of those who are more marginalized. And then just quickly on the biraciality. Oh, and I'll tell a quick story. So I was one of the founding members of the Asian Bar Association of South Florida. And interestingly, with another Japanese American, and that really colored in a very inward looking way the first agenda item, which was to repeal the alien land laws that had been on the books, which is a great thing. But maybe if there had been more diversity, there would have been a different outcome. And we really reached out to the South Asian Bar Association, who had way more members than just the general Asian Bar Association and was much more organized. And that was a very interesting moment of trying to build a coalition where the quote unquote broader Pan-Asian group was actually less powerful than the specific affinity group. So I tell that quick story, and then a quick note on biraciality. It's interesting because I think that people who are biracial and who have the opportunity to participate in whiteness have, a special obligation to be a thoughtful member of the minority group. And I think there is, a danger when you look at cases like Jessica Krug, right, of people trying to participate in minority status in order to enhance some claim to power that they shouldn't have, right? So that would be a bad part about it. So I've always been very aware of that in claiming Asianness, like very aware of my own situation within that space. On the other hand, I can say, a lot of people who are biracial have the experience of being rejected by one or both groups to which they belong. And it can be a very painful thing when people deny membership into a group, which, and just in my experience has happened quite often. And one quick story, and then I'll shut up. Nancy Leong tweeted out at some point on Twitter in the last few months, like, it's amazing how many firsts there are. I found out like I was the first Asian woman tenured at such and such, like that. And I said to myself, well, geez, I've been a faculty member at 3 law schools. I wonder what that, and it did turn out that I was the first Asian American woman to be hired at all 3 law schools that I've been a faculty member of. So I tweeted that out, which made some people say, not you. And so, I get it, but I do say that that's a painful experience. And I'll end there.
Ruchika, I can't hear you. Can anybody else?
The University of Detroit Mercy. So as an Arab American, can you speak?
Ruchika, it sounds like your sound is not quite working.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can you start over?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, brief technical difficulties. So thank you. We'll now hear from Amr Zahid.
Oh, it happened again.
So we got a great recommendation from a participant in
Are identified as white in certain contexts.
we got a great recommendation from the attendees. How about you just put the question in the chat, because it looks like you're cutting in and out.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, or I can ask it.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay, so let me introduce myself, I guess, since some of the technical stuff wasn't working. My name is Amr Zahar. I'm an adjunct professor of law at the University of Detroit Mercy, and I teach specifically on Arab Americans and the construction, the legal construction of race, the history of all that stuff, and how it specifically pertains to us. Now, as I've been listening to this for a little while, only for a few minutes, because we're in the middle of class today, but let me read the question that Nadia sent me, and then I'll get into what I wanted to say. But the question that was posed that she put in the chat was, as an Arab American, can you speak about ways that Middle East identities are included and excluded from discussions of Asia and Asian American? Geographically, the Middle East is part of Asia, but Arab Americans are identified as white in some context. So briefly, I think first we have to start with unpacking some of the terms that we usually use. We throw around the term Middle East and Middle Eastern. I think we have to be careful about these terms, first of all, right? These are like colonial Western terms. It really just means east of white people. It doesn't really mean anything that describes a culture. You know, just like we wouldn't refer anymore to China and Japan as the Far East in any sort of serious way, then we shouldn't really be referring to the Arab world as the Middle East or the Mid East. And even if you take the academic definition of Middle East, it's not all in Asia. And the largest countries of it, Egypt, for instance, which is 90 million people, is in Africa. So it's not an effective term to describe a culture or any sort of cohesive group of people. Really what we're talking about here is Arabs or the Arab world. And what we find ourselves in is something different, I think, than every other group that is sort of part of this conference today, which is that we're the only group as Arabs who are under the federal guidelines considered white, right? So the OMB has this directive where they define these different races, the races you see on applications, the races you see on the census and that kind of thing. And white, well, so, you know, there's American Indian, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and then there's white. And white is defined as people originating from Europe and Middle East and North Africa, okay? Which basically meant the Arab world. And how did that happen? That happened because, you know, as we all know and as we all teach, that the naturalization laws of America were rooted in white supremacy, and you had to be white in order to become a citizen, and that's the way it was until 1952. And a lot of different groups tried to get in, right? Japanese people tried to say they're white, didn't work out for them. Chinese people tried to say they're white. Indians from the Indian subcontinent tried to say they're white. And then these just sort of off-white people like us from what they called Syria back then, which is today like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, started showing up. And they were, there was conflicts in the courts as to whether or not these people were white or not white. And they eventually got whiteness, mainly because the vast majority of them were phenotypically not too dark. And more importantly, almost all of them in those early days, 100 years ago, that were immigrating were Christian. And judges noted that they were Christian. And so we're the only group that is in this sort of like limbo where we're white on paper, but we're clearly not white in society. And so when you have that situation, you are sort of stuck between two. There's no such thing as getting into whiteness, right? I mean, you know, whiteness has its own rules and its own club, and like we don't fit that. And also then gaining real solidarity with other groups who might think, because we have the formal label of whiteness, that we're somehow benefiting from that. And we're not. I mean, you know, I might get away with being a white guy for a conversation for 10 or 15 minutes with someone until they ask me where I'm from. And I say Michigan, and they say, where are you from? And then I say I'm Palestinian. And then that's it, I'm not white anymore, right? I mean, it doesn't last very long at all. And of course, this does extend to like people from Iran, and maybe basically as far as Iran and Turkey, who are technically parts of the Middle East, but aren't Arabs. So how do we fit in to a discussion? You know, sometimes my friends say to me, or you know, other Arab Americans say to me, I just checked the Asian box. I tell them, well, you know, I mean, okay, fine. I guess technically we're Asian, but we all know that that's not what they mean when they write Asian, right? So all these words, even though they might seem to depict a certain geography, we all know that that's not what they really mean, right? They have all these other racial and preconceived contexts that come with them. So the question I really have for other people here is, do you think we're white? You know, do you see me as a white person? You know, because I might be able to get away with it for a very short amount of time if I don't have a weird name and I don't have an accent, or if I'm a woman and I don't wear a hijab, or like, you know, are we seen as white in the context of Asian, as far as a really broad idea of Asian, by everyone else here? And if we are, then that's another problem that we have to deal with, because we definitely don't enjoy that status in white society, right? I mean, the way the state deals with us is never in the same way that the way we're described on the news, or the way that the national security apparatus, we all know that we should never try to rank sufferings, right? But white supremacy and white privilege and the state deals with different racial groups in different ways. So while Arab Americans are not going to have the same experience as Black Americans with, you know, police stops and law enforcement and sort of community police situations, we'll have a vastly different experience, vastly more negative experience than them and perhaps other groups when it comes to border control or FBI, or, you know, I know that when we were growing up, we got constant knocks on the door from the FBI. And that was simply because our existence was racialized as a threat to the state. And even sometimes when it's cast in a nice way, so you know, I'll just give two examples of the way it's clear that we're not white. So whether you look at Arabs as a group, or even if you look at Muslim as a proxy sometimes for Arab, which of course it's not, more than half of Arab Americans in America are Christian. But in 2016, when Hillary Clinton was debating Donald Trump said, you know, Islam hates us. And Hillary Clinton said, well, no, we need to have good relationships with Muslims because they're our eyes and ears in the fight against terrorism. Well, you know, what the hell does that mean? You know, I mean, that just means that we are cast, even by the liberal state, as how we can contribute to society in terms of national security, not really as real Americans. And then, of course, you have John McCain in 2008, when he was going against Barack Obama. He had a town hall meeting in Minnesota, and a woman walks up to the microphone and she says, I can't trust Obama, he's an Arab. And McCain says, no, ma'am, he's a decent family man. Okay, like that's it. That was the whole thing. So in other words, you can't be an Arab and a decent family man at the same time, and you can't be Arab and you can't be American at the same time. And you definitely can't be Arab and be president, right? And the most damaging thing about, everyone remembers that McCain episode. The most damaging thing about that McCain episode is that when Trump and other people have come and cast Arabs and Muslims in a very, very villainous way, McCain's episode was recast as a moment of tolerance, as a moment of, this is how you handle a situation like this. When a racist gets in front of you and calls someone Arab, you say, no, 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 they're not Arab, they're decent. Okay, and this was cast as, oh my God, how open-minded was McCain? And so even under the most like, I don't know, under the nicest circumstances, right, we are consistently cast as un-American and a threat to the state, and then cast by fellow non-white people sometimes as recipients or beneficiaries of white privilege because we're formally identified as white. That's the quagmire we Arab Americans find ourselves in. And we're still trying to get a box on the census form, and we still haven't gotten it. And in 2020 is the first time we'll ever be counted in the census. And it's only because Trump and the Census Bureau wanted to individually count what different kinds of white people there are, because they want to know how many Polish people, how many Italian people. They never wanted to know that before. Now we'll get an idea of how many of us there are, but only because whiteness is being broke down, not because we are being given our own category. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. I'll be happy to answer any other questions during this time as well. Thank you.
Hey, this is Nadia Ahmed. I'm gonna go next. I'm gonna just introduce myself also. I am an associate law professor at Barry University. I am also co-chair of the ABA's Environmental Justice Committee and a council member of the ABA section on civil rights and social justice. So I really want to thank everybody for joining us here today to be a part of this panel. It's really an example of Twitter coming alive on Zoom, and it's exciting to be a part of a panel where we have so many Zoom pros joining us. And so what I want to speak about from the paper on who counts as Asian is that it introduces a really novel diagnostic of racial assignment that has significant implications for how racial categories such as Asian are popularly understood, especially for populations for whom they purportedly apply. And it's based also on the analysis of the 2016 National Asian American Survey. And the authors here have found a gap between the government assignment of the Asian category and the Americans' understanding of it. And so that's really what we've been looking at and discussing. And so what is referred to as the disjuncture between in-group and out-group racial assignment. And in the same survey, when the survey sample was weighted, it used a ranking procedure to reflect the distribution of race and Asian detailed origin by each of the following dimensions, such as state of residence, gender, nativity, citizenship status, and educational attainment. And I wanted to touch upon one of the categories that was excluded, as well as one that I feel could benefit from more discussion, but I understand like the parameters of the survey. And so I wanted to speak about the role of religion as well as gender in this discussion of exclusion among Asian American populations. And so first, as an American Muslim woman, I think Islam has become, a focal point of national conversation post 9/11, despite the fact that Islam has been a force in the New World since at least for 500 years. And the Muslim presence in the Americas began at least since Cristobal Colon's maiden sea voyage, in which many Moors accompanied him in 1942. And so this gets to the point that Vinay was talking about, looking at the historical context of this. And so in my earlier research, I examined how Islam impacted slave and indigenous populations, along with how European explorers and later settlers also interacted with these populations. And so in synthesizing the development of Islam and Muslims and the interplay of these relationships also illustrates how threads of Islamic thought and culture streamed into early American legal and cultural norms. And so when we're looking at the presence of Islam in the Americas, it also provides for a paradigmatic shift so that Islam is seen less as a foreign and marauding force and more as an early collaborator in the shaping of American notions of justice, democracy, and freedom, and also as a harbinger for the call to American independence, slave resistance, and revolt. And the Latcrit analytical modalities that I had mentioned also offer a means for reassessing this hidden history and realigning critical Islamic legal analysis into a broader theoretical framework for coalition building. And I think the other part that is really important for me to consider is the idea of gender. And so attorney Mawish Shokut of O'Melveny and O'Meyer's authored an article called American Muslim Women, Who We Are and What We Demand from Feminist Jurisprudence in the Hastings Women's Law Journal. And she wrote in this piece about the need for a shift in the way jurisprudence views American Muslim women, and about realizing this group of American Muslim women as a distinct and agentic group. And that I think that the ways our identities are constructed are often deconstructed, as well as weaponized to suit third-party needs. And in that process, our voices are really lost and are not heard. And so it really harms, I think, the way that we are treated as groups. And also when we look at to see that there's not really as much like first person discussion and scholarship on these issues. And so, as a visibly Muslim woman like Ms. Shokut, I also feel like I've been struck by what feels like the hidden arrows of jurisprudence. I often feel like I'm in a petri dish as a law professor, like in a majority white legal academy, but like in the midst of this pandemic, along with the surge of BLM protests, The academy to me is actually what seems like a petri dish, like this bubble, because it really seems like it's out of touch with the larger realities of the larger subset of global populations. So for this global population of Asians, this global population of Muslim women. And so for me as a South Asian American Muslim woman, you know, I can look at this petri dish of the legal academy and not wonder why laws and racist systems are in place, whether it's ranging from over criminalization of Black and brown people to massive corporate bailouts that benefit white elites. The system really works the way that it has been designed to work. And so I think it's important to kind of think also about how all of these issues of identity really play together. And I want to just leave you with one small story. I had a student that came up to me after class one time and he asked me, "Are you from Asia Minor?" And he was somebody who was South Asian. And so I told him, "No, I'm from Asia Major, just like you." Thank you.
So sorry for the technical delays, everybody, but I hope you can hear me now. So now we'll move into a Q&A portion. So please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, awesome. Okay, so sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody, but I want to thank Nadia and thank our panelists for their presentation.
So I would encourage you all to use the
Q&A
function to submit any questions that you might have.
I see that we have some already. One of the questions that I just want to pose, it seems like we are touching a lot on the concept of solidarity and solidarity building. So using, the raise hand function for our panelists, I want to ask, what do you think, what kind of work, be it decolonization work, I know that was touched on by Sarah, what kind of work needs to be done to build solidarity, be it, within either the Asian American Pacific Islander category, if you want to use that, or, within the South Asian category? And do you think that this quest to define ourselves does it help or does it hinder this solidarity building?
So since you mentioned me, I'll just put in my 2 cents here. So first of all, my name is Syra, so just want to clarify that. I think one of the pitfalls of talking about identity in terms of how what identity is ascribed to us and what identity we ascribe to ourselves is that the critique of identity politics sort of really applies if it's just left there, right? If it's just about we need to be represented and be seen and counted, and there's value to that. But I think solidarity it's a politics, right? And it requires us to think about what our political commitments are. So for instance, I have absolutely zero political solidarity or any kind of solidarity with Nikki Haley and, these Naomi Rao and whoever it is else that's like out there doing, the work of white supremacy, right? Candace Owens or, this attorney general of Daniel Cameron in Kentucky. I mean, we have people who have a politics that are very, very different from us, even though they may have shared identity attributes. And so for me, solidarity isn't built on identity, it's built on politics. And I learned this the hard way, being at a school in which we have a majority of minorities, both students, and we have a sizable minority law faculty, in which we see time and time again, certain members of minority categories completely undermine efforts at diversity and efforts at racial inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they all show up to raise their hand to be counted when they want to be seen as a minority, and when that is useful, they want to capitalize on that and they want to cash in on that. But when it comes to actually taking a cost for other people and building sort of coalitions on issues that are important to minority life, they're out of there. And so this is why I say, I think if we talk about solidarity, I think there's 2 issues, and it's complicated. I think we must address the issue of who is an Asian in some respects in order to have a better understanding of the categories that are being used in different spheres, right? In some respects, I'm less concerned about who's an Asian to the general population than I am with who's an Asian to the state. You know, I have had the experience where I was sitting in a restaurant, and this, believe it or not, with two white people, and I said I'm Asian, and these two white people said, no, you're not, and they asked a waiter to come over and said to the waiter, is she an Asian? And he said, no, also a white guy. And they looked at me and said, see, you're not an Asian. I mean, this is like freaking aggravating, right? And did I want to kill them? Yes, I did. Did I? I didn't. But point is, that's less of an irritation to me than the state categorizing me as one thing or another for its whatever purposes it's doing it for, right? But in terms of our own personal solidarity projects, you know, that identity is important, but it's not as important as your political commitments, I think. And that I'll let others talk.
Could I chime in for a second here? Is that okay, Nadia? Can I chime in for a second? Oh, I assume it's okay. Okay, so to me, I find us as Arab Americans sometimes on the outside of these solidarity projects, and I can give you two sort of quick examples. One of them is in politics, right? So one of the core issues for Arab Americans is the Palestine question. And then, you know, trying to get solidarity with that with other communities of color, including other Asian communities or Asian community. I'm still not clear whether we're part of the Asian community, but, you know, other Asian communities is a very, very difficult endeavor, right? I mean, that is still a red line in all circles, whether they be liberal or conservative or Democratic or Republican or whatever. And finding that, because we do view the Palestine question as an anti-colonial question, as a domestic and foreign policy question when you have billions of dollars going to fund that project. And so where we have extreme difficulty finding solidarity in that. And then the other question of actual racial identification. So for instance, one of my students the other day, so we have a student portal where you can go in and you can ask for like fill out your profile, and there's a race question, you know, like the university keeps these this data on the students, and they use the federal categories, and we're in Detroit, which is the largest concentration of Arab Americans, and the University of Detroit Mercy doesn't have a checkbox for Arab Americans to identify themselves. So he sends me a message and he's frustrated, and every Arab American has had this, you know, experience at one time or another where they don't feel included, and other wasn't even a choice. So even like if you want to be other, that wasn't a choice. So I got in touch with administration at the university and I said, hey, can you help me with this? What's going on? And they said, they basically came back to me very quickly and said, you know, we sympathize with you, but these are the federal categories and we can't do anything about the federal categories because we get federal funding. And that's actually not true. I mean, the Department of Education itself has put out guidance that says if an educational institution wants to add categories for its own purposes, it can. But even at the base levels of like bureaucracy, because we're not part of the fabric, we're not seen as one of these minority groups physically by people, they don't see us as part of that. It's just not as much effort put in to sort of solve our problems. And now I'm going to have to like go the extra mile to educate them on Department of Education policy and all this kind of stuff. And then maybe, hopefully, I'll be able to get our students a box on the form. But this is the situation that we find ourselves in. All right, thank you.
Ruchika, I just wanted to, I have to jump off soon for another meeting, but I just wanted to say a few things. First of all, I think the different suggestions and critiques are well taken. In fact, one of the things I'll do in the statistical model is to see on gender. We do have religion data in there as well, so we can certainly add those to see if those make a difference in terms of, it's more on the predictive models in terms of, you know, the target of the populations. And we can't redo this. I mean, we could ask survey questions in the future, and I think even taking advantage of images and not just words to talk about and represent different populations and how how people might classify and categorize. Just a few things I want to say. I think it's both important to pay attention to how the state categorizes and treats, and society as well, right? And so maybe Asian Americans pay way too much attention to Hollywood and news media and visual representations and other representations, but they matter. I think especially in terms of societal relations that, ranging from discrimination to microaggressions to other acts of exclusion, I think we need to pay attention to those in addition to whatever the state may formally include or not. I think there's this really important question which comes up time and again in terms of whether Asian Americans or AAPIs, or what we're seeing in this category of APIDA, it's in a lot of college contexts, right? Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American. The question is, are we one or are we many? And I think as good academics, we always say it depends, right? But I think we need to be very specific. What are the contexts under which we have solidarity? What are the contexts under which we don't? What are the contexts under which it's important to be specific and down to what detail? For some people, maybe it's not sufficient to say Indian, for example, that it's like Tamil or Bengali or Marathi, right? Or Maharashtrian. Like, when are those contexts relevant? And I think it's okay to live with that complexity, but I think that specificity is important. And then finally, I think sometimes survey data can surprise. So one thing we didn't talk about in this was, there's another question we asked in the 2008 NOWS and as well as in 2016, where we asked, what, if anything, do Asians share in common? Do they share a common race? Do they share a common culture? Do they share a common political interest? Do they share a common economic interest? And our hunch going into it is we think of Asian American as a political category. So maybe that's where we would see the greatest ranking, that people think of Asians as sharing common political interests. But what we found in 2008 and in 2016 was the highest response category was to say that they share a common culture. Now that might blow most people's minds because we think of culture as either connected to particular things like religion, like language, maybe other markers, or maybe other aspects of culture. Most people might not think of Asians as sharing a common culture. We didn't have follow-up interviews to ask people, what did you mean when you checked off that box in the survey? Chances are it's probably some version of a minority myth. I hate to say it, right? And thinking that Asian Americans are much more highly indexed on caring about something like education or respect for elders. I think we need to unpack this. What does it mean, at least when people think that Asian Americans share a common culture? So I think there's a combination of survey research and qualitative research that are important to be able to unearth this. Thank you very much.
If I could just add one quick comment to piggyback, Karthik, on your work actually through from AAPI data, which is, for those of us in the field out, doing policy advocacy work, working on electoral politics, it does matter. It can matter. Your data has shown that, among AAPIs overall, we're a very progressive group. And, while I agree with Syra that skin folk are not always kinfolk, that we do know that there's much to be gained in terms of both electoral politics and policy solutions and coming together. And I will tell you, that is my work every single day, which is bringing together with all of our partner organizations, voters to vote in favor of affirmative action, to vote, for solutions to climate change. And I think when you look at that data, you see that we actually are much more aligned as an overall community than we might be in so many of the other ways we've discussed today.
Can I just
okay, wonderful.
With
Go
about culture? I think I interpret culture a little bit more broadly than Karthik just noted, and I think this relates to part of what Manisha, you were just saying, and that's because when I see students on campus engaging in various activities, they're engaging in various forms of quote culture. And the reason is when they're engaging with these identities, most often when I see them engaging with these identities of South Asian or Asian American, it's coming out of either pain or joy, right? It's the pain of not belonging, of being excluded, of being discriminated against, that they're trying to make sense of. And it plays out in these cultural settings, in parties, in meetings, in, you know, social clubs, in dance parties or whatever. And they're seeking these like moments of joy, right? Like that what it means to, you know, that moment where you see that expression on their face where, you know, they're in the middle of learning something about Asian American history, and there's that moment where they see themselves and they say, I actually belong here. I have a place in America. I have a history here, right? And that joy can be part of a social event where, you know, you have the chance to express or celebrate the successes of someone else. And I think culture is some of the ways that things that we might otherwise view as political or educational, it's the space that we all have to engage in, right? Whether we're in school, out of school, you know, at home, in the workplace.
It's interesting too, because I think I tend to think of culture as more specific, even than national origin. And so there you can think of people having cultural differences even within nationalities. But this concept that you're bringing up, Shruti, I think is really relevant. It's an opportunity for solidarity, which maybe Karthik or I or others would actually interpret more as political solidarity, but they recognize it in more of a cultural context. So it's always interesting as a researcher how you can listen to what the participants say and yet interpret them in ways that might perhaps be different than they themselves would say.
Does anyone else want to chime in? I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I'm going to go to our audience questions. So somebody posed an interesting question, Aya, to one of your points, talking about how do Asian adoptees fit into the analysis of racialized anti-Asian sentiment, and kind of what does that look like?
I guess I'll, start a conversation because it was during my portion, but I mean, I have to say that I'm not sure anybody on the panel has that kind of experience. I have quite a few friends, and I think this is because I have connections with an Asian community in Boulder, Colorado, and it just so happens that many, this is a very, very white space. And in fact, more than a few of my friends are in the situation of being Asian adoptees, and they find it to be, and also I have quite a few biracial white and Asian friends here, and they find some comfort, I think, in embracing the Asian identity and learning as much as they can because, on the one hand, and I think this is true of biracial people, you can, to an extent, I mean, a lot of this is also, as Vinay has pointed out, based on sort of these very contested identities and perceptions that people have of you, right? But at some point you can participate in white privilege or you get some of the benefits of white privilege. But on the other hand, you can feel a very deep sense of alienation from your Asian identity. So a lot of the people I know there have very much embraced trying to learn on their own about their identities, but they felt incredibly isolated from it and a sense of disenchantment and pain. So I think it's a struggle, right? I think that's one of the identity struggles that highlights just how complex this question is, right? It's a national origin question, meets a geography question, meets a culture question, meets a political and solidaristic question, meets an appearance question, right? And I think that that people in that situation are struggling with a lot of that question and may have underappreciated senses of disenchantment from the situation they're in.
All right, now that we are at 4, we will conclude. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this free webinar. We'd also like to express our extreme gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You are all doing such critical work, and we thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your knowledge, your research, and your experiences. The section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates around the country. We hope this your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining the section and becoming active in the ABA. You can do so by visiting AMBAR, that's ambar.org/CRSJ. You can find more information on other free programs on the CRSJ homepage. Best of luck in your work and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.